This is Gary Whitta, former editor-in-chief for PC Gamer magazine and a writer for Star Wars Rogue One.
You know, I was actually fortunate enough to interview Douglas Adams very early in my career. I was literally this kind of 16, 17-year-old spotty kid. He was very accommodating, and I remember a weird thing where he got down on the rug and started drawing concentric circles with his finger to try and illustrate something about the nature of the universe or reality that went way over my head. Grew up loving reading the books, and it was a big part of the reason why I wanted to be a writer was just seeing just what you could do with words on a page. Like, it never occurred to me that you could be that funny or imaginative. It's just brilliant. You can literally turn to any page in Hitchhikers and find something brilliant. I mean, it's hard to find another writer that can do that. And I think part of the reason why I loved him, you know, he was always a big tech guy, right? Mm-hmm. Have you read The Salmon of Tao?
Yeah.
Okay, so you know all these old essays. You know, he was really interested in computers and technology, and you know, part of that was, you know, he loved games.
Welcome to a very special edition episode of the Game Informer Show. I'm your host, Ben Hanson. With this episode, we're taking a deep dive look into the career of Douglas Adams, the author of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books and Dirk Gently, and specifically his role and involvement throughout his life in the video game industry.
Douglas Adams, best known for the hugely successful Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, has discovered a new way to startle, befuddle, and astonish his fans with a text adventure game.
Talking about how now we understand how storytelling in interactivity is becoming very popular, and we're waking up to that. I think Douglas Adams maybe realized that before almost anyone.
The area that kind of fascinates me at the moment is the interactive world.
And here's Douglas Adams himself speaking at a SIGGRAPH conference in 1997.
Yeah, we have this word interactivity now, which is been a sort of buzzword for the last few years. And the reason we have that word is because we now have things that aren't interactive. In the past, everything was interactive, and we didn't need a special word for it.
When somebody got up to tell a story to a bunch of people, he would say, well, there was this guy walking down the street, and someone would say, what was his name? When his name was spread, he was walking down the street. Where was he going? Well, I'll tell you in a minute. Hold on, and let me tell you the story. And the whole way in which a story would be unfolded would be a dialogue between the storyteller and the audience.
He said to Infocom and Steve Meretzky, yes, let's do it. Like, I'm interested to see what would happen if you took my stories and my words and put that in an interactive format and let people navigate their own way. You know, I think any serious aficionado of Douglas and Hitchhikers, you know, you have to include the game, not just the books and the radio show and the TV show and the films. The games are as much a part of that.
He definitely probably had a big influence on my writing and stuff.
And here's Tim Schafer, legendary game creator and the president of Double Fine.
Always liked him. And then Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was a game that I played. I don't think I finished it because it was hard. I loved all the Infocom games. That one was hard. That even just right at the beginning with that Babelfish puzzle.
It was pretty gutsy to make a puzzle that hard.
And finally, here's Steve Meretzky. I'm trying to remember how it worked. I remember you had to launch it against a towel or like intercept it with a towel.
It was a 4-step, kind of a Rube Goldberg-esque. The fish would shoot out and go through a hole in the wall. And there was a hook over the hole in the wall, so you'd have to hang your bathrobe on the hook, and that would cover the hole. So then the fish would shoot out, hit the bathrobe, and then slide to the floor and go through a grating in the floor. So then you had to put the towel, I think, over the grating, and then it would land on the grating, but then a lower half of the room cleaning robot would come in and scoop it up. And so then you had to put the satchel on the towel, but the lower half of the room cleaning robot, in an attempt to get to it, would ram into the satchel and send the fish flying through the air, where an upper half of the room cleaning robot would grab it out of the thin air. And so then the hardest part was you had to take the junk mail, which you might not even have gotten because it was just, sitting on your welcome mat as you were like flying out of the house to lie in front of the bulldozer. And you had to take the junk mail, put that on top of the satchel. And so then when the lower half of the room cleaning robot hits the satchel, it sends the Babelfish and this whole pile of junk mail flying up in the air in a big cloud. And the upper half of the room cleaning robot is darting all around collecting the junk mail as the Babelfish continues to sail across the room and land in your ear.
We don't very often get a chance at this podcast to talk to some old school designers. Is that offensive to call you an old school designer?
It's accurate and offensive.
Would you mind just telling the tale of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? How did that whole thing come about?
First of all, Douglas was an Infocom player, so he was, sort of pre-sold on the idea of doing an Infocom game based on Hitchhiker's Guide. We were introduced actually by Chris Cerf, who is the son of Bennett Cerf, the famous author and humorist. And he was friends with Mark Blank, and he was friends with Douglas Adams, and basically said, hey, you guys ought to get together.
And Mark Blank is one of the founders of Infocom.
And Douglas was actually in Cambridge doing a lecture at MIT. And while he was in town, we kind of met him. He came out to the Infocom office, and that's kind of where it all came together.
Were you involved in that first meeting then?
Yeah, just, sitting around a picnic table in this wooded courtyard. And that's where we had that first meeting.
So you want to describe, like, the mood of the Infocom office knowing that Douglas Adams was going to come in?
At the time, I mean, if that was like October of 1983, I mean, there only would have been, 10 people or so at Infocom. So there wasn't even that much office to, to get excited. But, I think it wasn't really... I wouldn't describe it so much as excited as just thinking, hey, this is really cool. Like Infocom is like getting to the point where, someone like a Douglas Adams is interested enough to come talk to us.
Can you set the scene at all for what it was like back in those days as far as like celebrities interacting with video game development or the video game industry at all?
Well, I mean, it was obviously way nichier then. I mean, very, not nearly as many people had computers at all. Those who had computers, to a great extent weren't using them to play games. There weren't really much in the way of casual games. The games tended to be, mostly science fiction or fantasy, big, spend tens and tens of hours playing type games. On the other hand, the sort of people who did have computers back then tended to be the early adopters, tended to be the more upscale people. And in fact, among the early Infocom players were some celebrities. One example is Robin Williams. Mark Blank even told me a story about one time his phone rang in the middle of the night, and it was Robin Williams, who had somehow gotten his number and was playing one of the Infocom games and needed a hint.
Just call directly the guy at the top? Okay. But I'm trying to get a feel for Douglas Adams' involvement with actually developing games. Is it fair to say that he was one of the first celebrities to want to kind of get his hands dirty?
Well, I mean, he definitely was a game player. He just loved computers, super early adopter of the original Macintosh. When we did actually start working on the game, which would have been very early 1984, probably February of 1984, he came and spent a week in Cambridge, and he brought, the old sort of boxy original Macintosh with him, which, was just out in February of 1984. And, he spent as much time just sort of playing with it and, sort of showing, interesting, software that came with it or that he had created for it or that someone else had given him for it than he did, actually writing the game. I mean, like I remember him playing some word games and stuff on that Mac. But I think he was mostly interested in sort of computers as toy rather than computers as a gaming platform. So like when HyperCard came out, he was so excited about HyperCard. It basically allowed you to create graphical programs very easily, even without any programming skill. And in fact, Myst, the game Myst?
Oh, yeah.
That was written as a HyperCard game. In fact, I remember an article that he wrote about HyperCard for one of the Apple magazines back in the day. And he said, the first sentence of the article was something like, Mozart, Velcro, and HyperCard. Pretty good for one civilization.
Do you want to just describe what that first meeting with Douglas Adams was like? What you guys talked about? What your impressions personally were of him?
I mean, it was more just sort of a get acquainted meeting, and we weren't really talking about a Hitchhiker's game. We were probably much just talking about, Infocom games in general and, kind of getting to know each other and maybe, not even talking about games at all. Because, I mean, he was I would say more than anything else, his kind of overriding characteristic when you met him is just he could talk in an interesting way on almost any subject under the sun. I describe him as sort of like the perfect dinner companion. Almost like any topic that comes up, he can kind of carry on, not just carry on a discussion about it, but contribute, sort of all sorts of interesting tidbits about it.
So do you think he was interested just in mingling with the great brains over at Infocom, or did he come in with the mission of, I want to develop some sort of game?
Well, I mean, the meeting was with the idea of, you guys should meet with the idea of creating a game, so it was definitely kind of the subtext of the meeting, even if it didn't dominate the discussion of the meeting.
And you want to just walk me through like what the collaboration would look like? Are you guys sitting in the same room together? Is he writing all the dialogue? How does this whole thing work with Douglas specifically then?
So the way it started with him coming out to Cambridge for a week, and we started working on the game. And at this point, I would say, I'm sort of feeling a little intimidated, both, obviously, famous author versus sort of, newbie game designer. But also, this is his baby. Hitchhiker's Guide is his, his idea, his intellectual property, and I don't want to be sort of coming in and stomping on it. So I would say toward the beginning of the project, I was a little more kind of letting him impose his own ideas. And then as we worked together more, I got a little more comfortable in sort of telling him, no, I don't think that's the way to go. And maybe that works, for a book, or for a radio play. I don't think, that's going to work as well for a game, etc. And we tended to write the game from beginning to end, not entirely, but in general, we kind of wrote it from beginning to end. And I think if you look at the game now, you'll see how the game starts out quite linearly. And then once you get to the Heart of Gold, then the game just sort of explodes into, far more nonlinear potential. And I think that was, and I think that's a demonstration of the fact that we were working together better, and that, kind of I was teaching him and kind of getting through to him some of the potential of non-linear storytelling.
Yeah. Were there big like do's and don'ts at the start of this game's development that he was stressing and you were stressing as far as just brainstorming what this thing could be?
I mean, I'd say the main do was it had to, kind of deliver on the expectations of people who were already familiar with the Hitchhiker's universe. And the main don't was don't just do an adaptation of the book. So, so that it needed to bring new stuff, that it needed to, essentially extend the Hitchhiker's universe, not just adapt the Hitchhiker's universe to a new platform.
Do you remember him kind of, expressing an appreciation for the depth and the potential of game design throughout the course of the project? Are there any moments that you could remember that stand out to you in terms of him being like, oh, we can do this?
Well, I remember one real moment of epiphany for him, which was, as we were working together, he would essentially write scripts of kind of, when you were playing an Infocom game and you could just turn scripting on and it would just produce, kind of a printout of everything that you said and everything that the game said. So he would essentially, his writing was essentially such transcripts, player says this, game says this, player says this, game says this, right? And the big epiphany moment for him was as we began building the game and started having really early playables, and he'd be back in London and have a friend visiting and sit the friend down in front of a computer and say, oh, you have to try the new Hitchhiker's game. And they would sit down, and instead of typing the exact thing that he was expecting them to type, they would type something else. And he was like, oh my God, I hadn't, like he'd sort of intellectually understood it, but at a gut level, he hadn't really understood that we had to handle, this huge galaxy of potential player responses.
Is that I mean, was it overwhelming then? Did you have to jump in and write some of those dead-end responses?
I mean, I was already doing that, but I think that, that was a good step in his education from, no, this isn't, just another way of telling a linear story to, this is an entirely new medium. And once he got it, I mean, he was just fantastic in terms of taking ideas from the existing Hitchhiker's universe and adapting them to an interactive environment in just the most creative ways. A good example, tea and no tea, having an inventory item which is no tea. and the words that, fall through the wormhole and start an intergalactic war. And his idea to make those basically the first time you got a parser failure, which is one of those moments where the parser says, I don't know the word such and such, or you use the word such and such in a way that I don't understand. Those were just failures of the parser. Basically, the parser saying, sorry, I'm only a 100K computer program. I can't figure out what you're talking about. And his idea to take the first instance of that and make those the words that start this intergalactic war, was just a brilliant use of the medium.
That is incredibly smart. I'm curious what he was like to work with. I mean, he's famous and even writes about it a lot himself for procrastinating, really taking his sweet time. Did it seem like one of those projects that was on the back burner, or was he excited about it personally?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that, saying that he's a procrastinator is way, way short of the truth. He was a world-class procrastinator. In fact, so we started the game in February, and by May, we were like nearing the time when the game was supposed to go into alpha testing so that it could be out for sale by Christmas. He was way behind on delivering, so much of the writing that he was supposed to have delivered. And, so he was maybe a couple months behind on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Game stuff, but he was like a year behind on So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. And in fact, it was like a year after the manuscript was due at the publisher, and he hadn't like written chapter 1 yet. And so his agent had basically said, you're banished from London, too many distractions here, too many friends, so sent him like to an inn way out in the country, like 4 hours to the west of London. And so in May, I traveled out to England to spend a week with him to finish the design and the writing on the game. And I went and I stayed at that inn with him where he was essentially banished to finish So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. When I was on press tour with him for the game, he was fond of saying that the job of a writer is to put a piece of blank paper into a typewriter and then stare at it until your forehead starts to bleed. I mean, for such a successful writer, he really did not like the act of writing.
Even when it comes to writing game dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, he loved finishing games. He loved kind of the early he loved finishing writing projects. He loved the early ideation on them, but the actual middle part, the creation of words and getting them down onto paper, that was like really an effort for him.
So what are you most proud of with the Hitchhiker's project?
Oh, I guess, just that we got it out at all. I mean, it was, like I said, as of like late May, the game, was maybe half designed and half written, and, went out to the West Country of England and essentially camped out on his doorstep, until we finished the design. And I mostly remember one day, the last full day I was there, and we had it almost all done except, there were sort of all these loose ends, and we didn't really have a final puzzle or a final kind of bringing together all of these loose ends. And we had the plant and the fluff and all these tools, and we knew it was going to end with you landing on Magrathea, but we just weren't coming up with any ideas of how to put it all together. And so he said, let's go for a drive. And we got in his car, and we're just driving like crazy, like 60 miles an hour on these super narrow, super windy streets with, like hedges, 10 feet high on either side so that, there's like no visibility at all. And we finally get to the coast, an area called Exmoor National Park, which is sort of on the, that peninsula of England that sort of sticks out to the west. And then, you could see distantly across the foggy waters, you could see whales. And so we're sitting there on the beach on a piece of driftwood surrounded by wild sheep. And it was there that we finally hammered out this final puzzle of, the plant basically giving you a look into the future, knowing which tool Marvin was going to ask for so that, you could go into the little tool closet and have the one tool ready to hand him. And then I flew back to Cambridge. And in like one insane 10-day period of working around the clock, I got all this sort of second half of the game that we designed. I got it implemented and into testing.
Wow. So in that most British environment possible, sitting on a piece of driftwood there, like, what does it look like? Is it him staring up into the sky and saying, take note, what if this does this? And then you're scrambling on a notepad, or what does it actually look like?
No, we're just, sort of sitting on this piece of driftwood just saying, well, what about this? No, that's not going to work because of this. Well, what about this? No, that's not going to work either, and and I can't remember the exact details of the conversation. I just know, that, when we got up from that piece of driftwood, we had it all hammered out.
So how long did the actual project take in development then?
So we started in February and the game was on store shelves in October.
Jesus. You talked a little bit about Meretzky and that being the end of the game. How did you figure out where to scope it and to not tell the entire story of that first book?
I don't really remember how or when we decided that the game would end at Meretzky. It might be that we just sort of started working on it and it became clear that, sort of that point in the storyline was kind of a game's worth. Keeping in mind that at that point, a game had to run on things like, the TRS-80 Model 1 and the Atari 400, 800, and had to fit on a floppy disk with a maximum capacity of maybe 100 to 110 kilobytes. I guess, in retrospect, it seems like kind of a logical breakpoint.
Yeah.
So might have very well just gone in from the beginning thinking that that's where the game was going to end.
Gotcha. Were you guys talking about making a sequel at any point?
Oh, well, yeah. At the original contract that we signed with Douglas was for a 5-game deal, a 6-game deal. I forget. But we finished the Hitchhikers game. And then he was like, I'm so sick of Hitchhikers. I've written 4 books, the teleplays, the game now. I don't want to, jump right into another Hitchhikers thing. And so he said, I've got another idea for a game. Let's work on that game. And then we'll go and do the next Hitchhikers game. And of course, the Hitchhikers game did really well. So Infocom was very excited, to get to the next Hitchhikers game as soon as possible. And his idea, for the game that he wanted to do next was Bureaucracy.
And this is the fundamental premise which lies behind this game.
And here's Douglas Adams himself explaining why he's so excited about that game.
Your object is to get your bank to acknowledge your change of address card, but you go through hell in order to try and achieve it. So anyway, in this game, you will end up in a country called Zalagasa. You cannot avoid getting there. You will run into terrible trouble at the airport. You're trying to get to Paris. Whatever method you try to reach Paris by, you will end up hanging from a tree in the middle of the jungle, from a parachute in the middle of... You either will have been thrown off the plane, or you will have parachuted out with a hijacker who's taken you as a hostage, depending on which flight you get on. Or if you've really got the wrong flight, you'll actually find yourself in a plane belonging to the Zalagasa Parachute Club. And there is no way you can avoid it. And so you are driven through this game by the sort of demons of bureaucracy.
And that became kind of like the project from hell.
You don't say.
A whole series of other game writers at Infocom were assigned to the project. And he was, sort of up to his old tricks in terms of, delaying on his deliverables. And the project kind of dragged on for years, and, people who were assigned to the game would get reassigned to another game that was, actually further along or had a better chance of coming out. And then, after like 3 years of this, Douglas himself kind of lost interest in the game. And a friend of Douglas's, another British humor writer, Michael Bywater, agreed to step in and sort of take over Douglas's writing assignment on the game. And the game finally got done. But by that point, it's now 1987. And, the whole text adventure market is starting to dry up. The game, did a fraction of what Hitchhikers did. And then, at that point, people began working on ideas for the long-awaited Restaurant at the End of the Universe game. But, by that point, the writing was on the wall, and we were into sort of the last days of Infocom. And actually, the contract that we had with Douglas gave us the right to write Restaurant at the End of the Universe without his involvement. So we could have just immediately done it, and probably in retrospect, that would have been the right decision if we'd known, how things were going to go on Bureaucracy. But, everyone at the time said, oh, no, we'd much rather do this as a collaboration with Douglas, than just do it without his involvement.
Because he was so well regarded, did people within Infocom see him as like, oh, that lovable Douglas, oh, I wish he would write, boy, it's kind of frustrating? Or was it like a very serious business discussion every once in a while of like, this is a serious concern, the fact that he's not getting this stuff done?
Oh, it was sort of a love-hate relationship. Everyone really liked him as a person, and everyone was, really impressed with his work when he did work, and everyone was really frustrated with, the many broken promises of, I'll get something to you next week, and then, a month would go by without anything.
You should have sent him out to a cabin out there somewhere in Massachusetts and just forced him to work on this.
Well, yeah, obviously that worked on So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, so...
So how did he get out of this deal then?
Well, we never got out of the deal. The deal just expired after however many years from the day it was signed. Having produced only 2 collaborations with Douglas instead of the, maximum number that was originally called for.
Sure. There's nothing you can do. Did you get a sense that once Bureaucracy came out, even though a lot of it wasn't written by him, is it fair to say a majority wasn't written by him then?
Well, certainly the total idea of the game was his, the structure, all the sort of major plot points. And, in terms of all the words that appeared on the screen, maybe, a quarter of them were written by him or so.
Did you get the sense when Bureaucracy came out that Douglas Adams was proud of it?
Oh, yeah. We were proud of it creatively. It was quite good. It was frustrating that it took so long, but the game was a hoot, and it was one of the better packages we did. And, it was critically well received. It just, didn't sell that well, but really no all-text games at that point were selling well. So
also the game is called Bureaucracy.
Well, yeah. It wasn't really a fun theme, but it was a fun game.
Yeah, so you mentioned the package for it. I don't know what the package looked like. Do you want to describe it?
Well, probably the best thing was this 3-part form. It was that carbonless kind of form with like a white page and a yellow page and a pink page. And it was I think it was a credit card application. But the really hilarious thing was all the fields on the second and third page were completely labeled differently than the fields on the first page, so that if you did fill it out, and then like looked at the second and third page, everything that you had written had a completely different meaning.
So, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is also legendary for an amazing package and just having the peril-sensitive sunglasses that you couldn't see through and all that kind of stuff. How involved were you guys in that design, package design, versus Douglas Adams specifically?
Douglas wasn't too involved in the package design. That all got done locally by an agency in Cambridge. I remember that I was pushing to have a towel included in the package, and obviously a full-size towel. There's no way that could fit in the package or would in fact be affordable. But I was thinking that a fun thing to do might be to get like a little 1 inch by 1 inch piece of terry cloth and put that in the package, along with like a little warning note saying, warning, do not expose your towel to, proximity with magnetic media or it could cause it to shrink. One story, it was toward the very end, and Douglas had come back over to Cambridge for just a final week of kind of writing and polish just before we released the game. And he was leaving at the end of that week, and I was saying goodbye to him as he was off to the airport, and I was going into a meeting with testing. And I said to him, the testers are up in arms about the Babelfish puzzle. They think it's too hard. What should I say to them? And he said, he sort of paused for a moment, and he said, you should tell them to f*** off.
What happened in the mid-'80s, graphics started to come along, and to begin with, they were really not very good. So I think, they kill off text games. And I sort of think, well, I think I'll just sort of go off and get on with my day job. But then the graphics get much better, and you see games like sort of Myst coming out, but where the graphic realization of these sort of fantastical worlds is wonderful. And so I thought, well, that's terrific, but then nothing, but there's nothing in it that has the same kind of compelling or the same sort of engaging quality I felt as the old text adventure games. So I thought, well, basically, I've got to bring them together. And everybody said, well, that was nonsense, that's madness. So I thought, oh, well, that's good, because nobody else is having a go.
I mean, I can introduce you to some of the people who worked with him, when he had his own game studio, the Digital Village.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And, they, for example, they did the Starship Titanic game.
Hello.
Hello, Robbie.
Hi there, how you doing?
Hey, doing real good. How you doing, sir?
Very well, thank you. Very well indeed. Nice to meet you.
This is Robbie Stamp, the CEO of Digital Village and eventually the executive producer of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy movie from 2005.
I got a job in television, I became a TV researcher, became a TV producer, and it was in that incarnation that I met Douglas Adams for the first time. And I went along to Douglas's house in Islington, and we got on very well from the beginning, really. He talked about Bach, and we talked about a book called The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse. Which is an astonishing book, not very well known these days. Actually, a lot of people don't know it, but it's a very intricate, intellectually exciting book, which looks at patterns in things, the pattern in a piece of Bach music, and the way that might be reflected in the way in which certain moons orbit around the planet Jupiter, for example, and then that might be echoed in a stanza or a verse from a piece of beautiful 11th century Sufic poetry, and it's played on an abacus-like game device. And Douglas loved that, and I loved it, and kind of because lots of people didn't know about it, it was always a little bit of a bonding thing for us. So I met him, we got on well, we became friends, and then we set up the company together. So I came up with this idea called Cable City for a series of themed channels, which would be done at a completely new production base using very, very lightweight new camera technology and so on. Digital Village was originally Cable City, but then we focused on the media aspects of internet and game and so on. And I was sitting with Douglas in his wonderful, lovely house in Islington, talking about all of this, and how excited I was to see it was a whole new way in which you were going to be able to anchor a completely different kind of relationship with media through the internet. Bear in mind that all this stuff is just completely taken for granted now, but back in the 90s this wasn't the case. And Douglas said, well, that sounds interesting. How much would it cost to be a partner? And I'd like to invest in that. And I plucked a figure out of the air, and that was it. We were partners in the setting up of the Digital Village, which remains one of the most exciting things I've ever done in my life.
And as far as see, the way it works, from my point of view, it's like this. When I started out, I was doing radio and television, stage, and all sorts of different things. And then, because of the success of that damn book, it ended up that I was just writing books. Right. And it was fine to begin with, but after a while I began to think, hang on, I'm just sitting in a room typing, and I actually wanted more fun than this. So really what I wanted to do was to have a regular infrastructure so that I could develop more ideas than I could necessarily do just as an author sort of sitting working by myself.
I think Douglas was always very interested in the particular kind of possibilities and constraints that any medium afforded. And I think Hitchhikers had started in radio, where it was, possible to, have two, millions of robots singing songs together and whales, meditating on the nature of existence as they plummet to Earth. And so his imagination, had absolutely free reign. And then there was the television series where, of course, you're much more constrained. But each time round, Douglas was believed that actually, it's the constraints and the boundaries that, mean you come up with creative solutions. And indeed, in the writing of the book, a lot of the science fiction stuff is actually ways of solving narrative plot problems and holes, rather than actually, he didn't set out to write science fiction like an Arthur C. Clarke set out to write science fiction. What I've always thought was very interesting about him creatively is that he made so many imaginative leaps in those books. And then from an intellectual point of view, he spent a lot of the rest of his life filling in those gaps, reading endlessly about science and evolution and technology as we know. I think what attracted him to gaming was here was another place in which the characters that he'd created or wanted to create could play with new sets of rules, new forms of interactivity which the audience could have with his characters. And he was challenged by finding out what the medium could do and what it couldn't do. The other strand for Douglas, and I think this is a really important thing to understand about Douglas's intellectual and creative self, I think, is that his capacity to want to see things from strange and unusual angles. A lot of his thinking was about point of view and the kind of thing that a game medium provides you with, to be able to look at odd angles and, have points of view from different strange parts of the room, or, the way you're thinking about the solving of a puzzle. Those things were all very challenging for him.
So with Digital Village, was he excited about creating new IP and new ideas and new worlds? Did you get any sense that he kind of felt like the Hitchhiker's world was a safe backup that you could always fall back to?
It's a very good question. I think as far as Douglas's attitude to Hitchhikers was concerned, and I think he's said it himself, was both a blessing and a curse. Like a lot of people who have success very young, so he was only in his mid-20s. There's a sort of gravitational pull that exerts. And it's both wonderful, it's financially wonderful, it's creatively wonderful, it's producing adoration and fans. But it's also, I think, sometimes a little bit difficult to escape that gravitational pull. And he also had so wanted there to be a movie and was so frustrated that there wasn't a movie. That I think, too, took up quite a lot of just pure emotional energy, which can sap creative energy as well. So I think that for Hitchhikers, but what the Digital Village provided him with was a space to create and think, and not necessarily have to be the one to follow through on all of it. I can be involved, but I don't have to do all of the heavy lifting on my own. The thing we got to work on to start with was Starship Titanic.
I'd forgotten what I was going to say. Oh, yes. My name is Fentable. I am the doorbot serving on this, the maiden voyage of the Starship Titanic, the ship that cannot possibly, go wrong.
I then come from a television background. I, as chief executive of the company then, I was its chairman and chief executive, I had no idea how difficult it was going to be. I had no idea. And we set out to do not just one ludicrously ambitious thing, but about 5 ludicrously ambitious things all at the same time. That really absorbed most of the energy of the company for the first 18 months to 2 years. And I think that the thing that I sort of had completely underestimated really and I think Douglas underestimated, actually more, was Douglas's experience had been with the great Infocom parser games, so text-based adventure games, go north, pick up key kind of stuff. And Hitchhikers was a famous one of those. And that had involved him working with just 1 or 2 programmers. And I think he found the whole process of having to work with a much bigger team. And I mean, as an author, Douglas notoriously sweated over deadlines, and well, he didn't sweat over deadlines; he just missed them. He had control of the medium. He had control of the words. He was, in his phrase, he was chipping away at the block of marble himself. And I think what he found with his first big experience of a big gaming team was that the capacity to iterate quickly, to see if that worked, does it work, no, it doesn't work, move on. Those kind of things in terms of the way development was done back then, either not very many people were doing it, but we certainly weren't doing it. I think it was a much longer, slower process, and I think he found some of that quite frustrating, not being able to sort of get his hands on the programming program. He couldn't write a program to make something go faster. He couldn't do that. I think the main thing I remember from Starship Titanic, apart from just how hard the team worked, was there was a lot of laughter as well. A remarkable group of people. I mean, sadly, the lead programmer, a wonderful man called Tim Browse, died several years ago. The woman who took over as producer, a wonderful woman called Emma Westecott, who is now Dr. Emma Westecott. She's a leading figure in thinking about sexual politics around gaming and game design and game development. She lives in Canada now. She was a remarkable woman. She was already very tall, and when she put on her big stack boots, she was about 6'3", and she at one stage had a completely shaven, she's blonde, completely shaven head, so she looked like Tank Girl, and she was the producer who hauled everybody over the line. She was absolutely remarkable. She'd be somebody fabulous to interview.
Hello.
How's it going, Emma? And here's Emma Westecott, an associate professor in Toronto, Canada. We
never really expect these moments in our lives to become, to sort of set the tone for things that come afterwards, really.
I'm just curious what it was like to work with somebody that the outside world likes to call a genius. Were there moments amongst the staff where everyone's like, oh, clearly today he defined himself as a genius?
It's so interesting because so many people were there, had fallen in love. You know, Hitchhikers had been the very first sci-fi that they'd read as a sort of 12, 11-year-old, as is many of our sort of experience with it. And it's such a sort of like formative encounter, an encounter with, as you say, the sort of like voice of genius, that there's a sort of positive side of genius and there's a negative side. I rarely saw a negative side because he was always so excited. Like I remember he was, when he first started going over to Hollywood, when there were first talks of the film, he came back and told us that he'd been on James Cameron's boat and he'd been out on a trip. And he was just so excited and starstruck at having been around these Hollywood stars. And I'm thinking, how can you be starstruck when we're all so starstruck about having, you know, you around? And I think that was part of the charm of the man. And I don't know whether that's unique to him or whether it's unique to his particular generation, but his genuine excitement and interest in the world around him was something that was really contagious. I would say that his genius lay in his ability to sort of be enthusiastic and to share enthusiasm with a group of people that he worked with. And it really didn't feel like we were working for him. It really felt as if we were working with him, right? He'd come in and he'd talk about something that had really excited him that he saw, and it was impossible not to be excited about it as well. I think he was less of a gamer and more of somebody who was interested in game design, game development as a form of self-expression.
But he wasn't talking to you about Doom 2 back in the hallways of Digital Village or anything like that?
Not hugely, no. I think he was famously petrified and nauseous of blood. So anything that sort of resembled a sort of splatter would have caused him to faint. And so I don't think that he spent an awful lot of time in those FPS of the day. But I think he was fascinated by the craft of game development. We had a relatively small team, and he seemed to be equally interested in all parts of it.
We created an engine, a natural language parsing engine, would you believe, called Spooky Talk, which to this day is a sort of little sort of slight dead end in game development, really, that nobody's followed through. But of course, Starship Titanic has gone on to be this huge cult out there on the web.
Do you want to talk about Spooky Talk a little bit more, break down exactly what that system meant?
Yeah, well, the idea was, and there would be people who'd be technically much better suited than I to talk about the real nitty-gritty of this. But the idea was to be able to, through obviously it was a text interface, it wasn't a speech interface. You would type a question into one of the characters to ask one of the characters something. And we put this unbelievable amount of effort to try and get them to respond to you as if they were responding afresh with, and the sheer mathematics and branching possibilities of that, and having to think creatively and imaginatively of interesting answers, record those answers, think about all the programming branches and threads that would allow you to arrive at those answers. It was an absolute, I mean, that in itself, quite apart from, of course, the programmers classically doing we'll build you our own game development engine, the 3D engine. It was, as I say, if I look back now, it was good that I, at that stage, was young and naive. And of course, Douglas, being Douglas, wanted it to be fabulous. There was a whole part that he wanted to do, which was we were creating what he called the matter side of the ship, but he wanted to create a whole abstract environment called the data side of the ship. And that we weren't able to do. And I remember a meeting with the programmers where we were running late, sort of saying, right, we're going to have to cut a level. What are we going to cut? And they went, sorry, the game is not designed like that. The game means that something you do in minute 3 is paying off in a massively complex way that Douglas has thought of, and it just doesn't work like that. It was in that sense more like a sandbox game.
So towards the end, I have to say, I think I was practically banned from the programmer's room, because every time I'd go in and say, hey, I've just had an idea, why don't we put in a bit whereby, and they'd say, no, go away, we've got to get this finished.
One of my favourite stories about him was how hard it was to say no to him, because when I ended up producing, because we were late and we triggered the famous deadlines whooshing past speech, which was perfectly apt for the situation we were in. We had to sort of scope back, and one of the things that went out was the Starship Titanic was always meant to have a pre-rendered side and a sort of real-time rendered side, and we had to scale back significantly on the real-time stuff, partly because of the technical choices with the way that we were building the engine, and partly just to do with sort of time and stuff. And I was always really nervous about going into to let him know that wasn't going to happen, because it was like going into a Moroccan bazaar where you'd have to be really careful what you said yes to, otherwise you'd come out having created more work than you'd sort of like cut out and sort of stuff like that. So I remember an openness and an accessibility and a generosity, which, as I say, is not something which you'd necessarily have expected working with somebody who was that and is still that sort of well respected and regarded and stuff. It was a pretty special access point. I remember at one point I was really cross because I was in my 20s and I was often really cross about lots of things for some reason. And he said, "What can I do to help?" And I said, "Lose the arseholes." And he said, "I can't do that." I said, "Well, give me champagne." And then the next day I walked into the office and there was an orange boom of champagne next to my desk. So he'd acceded to some of my demands.
So you want to talk about like Douglas on a day-to-day basis with the studio? How much time did he have to devote to the digital village? Was he wandering around getting in design meetings? Like, what was that like actually on the ground with him?
Yeah, no, I mean, he absolutely design meetings. He would look at all the designs. He was across all of the script. Every character, every room, every environment would be something that Douglas would sign off on. So he was very, very involved. In those design meetings, he was fun. He was funny. He was supportive. He loved the programmers desperately wanted to be able to please him and do the things that he wanted to be able to do. So he was very involved. It wasn't a sort of swan up once every 4 or 5 weeks. He had an office there where he came to work most days, and he would work with various colleagues, and you'd hear sort of gales of laughter coming from the office as they thought up another character or another piece of dialogue. So he was very involved. He was a very big presence, as you know. He was a very big man. He was 6'5", so he was a big literal presence and absolutely a presence. It wasn't I've lent my name to this thing and I rock up once a month and sort of swan around for 5 minutes. He was very, very involved.
Right on. What'd you learn about him and his creative process from the development of Starship Titanic?
That's a really good question. I think what I learned is that Douglas is what I would call a primary creative, in the sense that he, like all great artists, I think, fundamentally interested in what he's interested in. So what I think was we talked about it a little earlier. What I think was slightly frustrating for him was not having his hands on as many of the tools of the creative process. Actually, by that I mean his hands, as he was used to having as a novelist. Because the irony, in a way, is that Douglas was an immensely gregarious man. He liked company. He liked reading things to people, seeing them respond. Do they laugh? Do they not laugh? Is that thing got a rhythm which works? So, in a way, it was an irony that his massive success came about as a result of a radio series, which of course was hugely collaborative, and then the book, and of course book writing is hugely solitary. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was notoriously, to his poor publishers, sort of hair tearing out concern, difficult to pin down, and found, because it was lonely. So I think there was a sort of an interesting tension there for him in wanting to do these bigger things, finding it frustrating that his hands couldn't be on as many of the levers. But equally, he liked working in teams. But in a way, like all very primary creative people, it was his stuff that he was most fundamentally interested in. I remember a call with our partners who were the publishers in America, then Simon & Schuster, the publishers who were doing games back then. The game was running late, and this was a very interesting sort of moment of cultural difference between America and Britain, and indeed between East Coast America and Britain. So the game was running late. My counterpart at Simon & Schuster was anxious, and understandably so. And we were having quite a sort of summit phone call, the two of us, about what we were going to do about stuff. And I could feel him getting more and more anxious. And I couldn't work out why. And then I realized that actually I was being very British, and that the more anxious he was getting, the calmer I was getting. And he mistook my calm for just not getting it. And he kind of expected to hear the sound of programmers being defenestrated as I spoke, and people being fired as I spoke. So I finally said, oh, no. This is me just being very British. I do get, what the problems are, and we're trying to solve them.
How much of the game being delayed and missing dates was a result of just how complicated the project was versus, hey, Douglas is not sitting down and writing this dialogue that we need him to? Was it a result of his procrastination at all?
No. This was, I think, an instance where Douglas is famous. I love the whooshing sound deadlines make as they go by. Really wasn't the problem. It was simply the blistering complexity of what we were trying to do.
Yeah.
And trying to innovate in too many areas at the same time.
I remember some amazing parties, and it was about the time that Nerf guns were sort of like first really popular, and I think that we managed to sneak off on one of our trips to California to go and sort of buy a whole bunch of Nerf guns and then take them back to the studio. So it was a fairly sort of raucous place, if you can imagine, with a whole bunch of sort of 20-somethings, and Douglas and his sort of colleagues and sort of like peer group around. So I can remember it being a lot of fun. I think that when we went into crunch, we were lucky for a couple of reasons. We had one person who always went home. We used to play Mario Kart every morning about 3:00 and then go back to work, and then there'd be showers at the office. So it was a really great environment, if you're going to have to do that 24-hour thing, to be able to think about how you break up that 24-hour work period. So the person who went home was the person making the decisions, because they had the clarity of. So you always need somebody who's got that clarity of mind, right?
It was really hard work. It was really scary for a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think we created a little mini cult classic, which still seems to sort of to grow and grow and grow. I think the biggest single problem with it in the end was its gameplay, and which is a pretty major problem. But the problem was simply that it was too difficult to start with. So the reward structure at the very beginning of the game simply, it was too difficult to get past this one particular bot and into the ship. And I think a lot of people just peeled off relatively early. Those who stayed with it absolutely loved it. But I think that one simple fundamental mistake, and that betrayed my own lack of experience as a TV producer. You know, I didn't understand until it was too late that fundamental reward structure at the beginning of a game to get people started. And by the time I did, it was too late, and we were set on that path, and all those things about shipping and release dates and things. You just got to. In the end, you can miss one, but you can't miss two.
Right.
We had to do what we had to work what we had.
It remains to this day a really sort of like special experience, not purely because of Douglas, but also because of the people that Douglas managed to bring together and to attract.
Our challenge is to make sure we don't try and, because we're a very young, small company, and 2 years ago we didn't employ anybody at all. Now we've employed enough people to create this game over the last 2 years, and it's actually been a phenomenal achievement. When I say that, because not to congratulate myself, but the running of this project, the managing of this project, has been the most phenomenal task, and that's been done, largely by our CEO, a guy called Robbie Stamp, who's really sort of taken this on his shoulders and done a magnificent job.
I mean, Robbie is amazing, and he remains, and the Digital Village remains one of the very best places I've worked, largely because of the care that Robbie put in to the working environment, and to making everybody feel heard, facilitated and nurtured. And that really, again, at the time in your early 20s, you think that's normal. And then it isn't until you get a little bit further on that you really appreciate how rare that is.
Gameplay aside, I wish we'd been across that one. I wouldn't have, not done any of what we did. I mean, it was the spooky talk and all the ambitions. I'm proud of it to this day.
What we decided to do in this game is go for the non-psychopath sector of the market, and that was a little hubristic, because there really isn't a non-psychopath sector of the market, it turns out.
Do you seem overly frustrated by the entire process? Once you guys shipped the game, was he like, well, I'm done with this scale of game development, this isn't for me? Or what was his impression at the end of the project?
No, I think we could well have gone on to do other things. Even way back then, something to this day that I still think we should do, which was looking at online multiplayer games, because I think that the idea of a multiplayer game based on the idea of Magrathea, the planet building game, is just would be very, very natural to do, and we were talking about that back in the late 1990s.
Now, I heard a rumor that the next game that you're possibly working on may be a platform game based around Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Is there any truth to that?
Almost certainly. And having done a text-only game of Hitchhiker, and now having done this mixture, this hybrid game with Starship Titanic, I just feel that the most interesting thing to do, for the sake of variety, not only of actually, most important, variety of what you get to work on, is to do a console game of Hitchhiker.
Douglas died. It ran out of time. It ran out of money, and that was all very sad. And a lot of the original team had sort of gone across to make that work, and that never saw the light of day.
What was that like then? Was it also a Myth-style adventure?
Yeah, it was going to be that kind of an adventure game, but it never saw the light of day.
That was something that sort of was happening despite the film being made at the same time, or not necessarily being explicitly connected apart from through Douglas. My understanding is that it was like 90% finished, and I still don't know where those assets are, because part of me feels that it would be a great title to still release.
Yeah,
it's any way of doing that, right?
The last time I saw him, he was actually in town once again to give a lecture at MIT. And that was about 6 months before he died. And we had dinner and, didn't really think anything of it as we said goodbye. But then 6 months later, he was gone. That last time we met, he was actually either on his way to or on his way back from LA, where he was working on two things, a script for a Doctor Who movie, and also the long-running Hitchhiker's Guide movie project, which, of course, did finally come out after he died.
Yeah.
And at that point, he spoke, kind of optimistically about the movie, even though, there had been, 10 or 20 years of disappointments.
I remember at one point he wrote that trying to get a movie made in Hollywood is like trying to cook a steak by breathing on it. Which I always like that stupid analogy.
we talked together the night before he died. My father had died that day after a very short illness. And Douglas and I talked that evening, and he was very kind and sweet and solicitous and thoughtful. And we talked of all sorts of ideas about the movie and evolutionary ideas and his interest in games and his interest in graphics and his interest in the way that was going to speed up and thinking about online multiplayer games. So yes, I think he would have retained an interest because he was curious. And if there's one word that I would use to describe Douglas, it was curious, relentlessly curious. And I think that, working with exciting game teams would have been something that he would have loved to do. And we wanted to make a game based on the Glass Speed game. He wanted to make a game which was based predominantly on sound and sound instructions. There were all sorts of things that he would have been wanting to play with.
Wait, sound instructions? How would that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I heard myself saying that, I mean, it never got. It was the idea of a soundscape where maybe you'd be navigating, particularly using sound to navigate. He was interested in a haptic virtual reality, so there maybe would have been a tactile component to that.
I think he'd probably be really into VR just because of his sort of love of hardware as toys and sort of whatever was the newest, cutting, edgiest thing.
He would, of course, been very interested in anything to do with mobile devices. But because of the creativity, his immense creativity, I've no doubt that things like multiplayer games, creating the environments, and seeing what emerged from those things. So because of his interest in evolution, he would have very, very interested in the concept of emergence. So in a lot of games now, which create things which there's much more space for emergence than there was in a game like Starship Titanic, where, however smartly we tried to think about pathways, there were only so many things. And of course, with a lot of modern gaming, there's far more possibility. Yeah. And I think that Douglas would have quite enjoyed thinking about that from an evolutionary perspective.
I wish he was around today to still be writing articles about computers and iPhones and where we are as a people, and has this kind of technology and this interconnectedness. Has it made us more connected or less connected? I just think he would have a fascinating perspective on all of that. A terrible loss, not just in terms of the books that he would have continued to write. He was obviously just an incredible humanitarian, cared deeply about. You should read Last Chance to See as well if you've never read it. The book, he went around the world and kind of looked and studied species that were on the verge of extinction and cared deeply about the world and people. But yeah, in terms of the video games and the tech side, I think that if he'd been around today with the technology that we now have and the understanding we have of how storytelling can work in games, he would probably be collaborating with someone, Telltale or whoever the equivalent of Infocom would be now, and creating something that is so much greater than anything we have today. So I've gotten quite sad now thinking about it. So thanks for that.
We haven't really touched on it too much, but do you want to talk about the legacy of that original Hitchhiker's game? And were you involved, or do you stay current on the re-releases and the updates throughout the years?
Sure. I was involved in the big re-release in 2004, which was the 20th anniversary. The BBC basically rewrote it so that it would run on the web. And then I was over in England when that 20th anniversary release got nominated for the BAFTA for Interactive Game of the Year, which is, kind of the BAFTA is sort of the British equivalent of the Oscar. I never expected it would win, just sort of a 20-year-old re-release of a text adventure, but it did.
Do you think part of it was a tip of the cap to Douglas Adams?
I think so, yeah. That would have been just a few years after he died. And so, we had the one statuette, and what we decided is we'd all take it for 3 months. And, I was in Boston, there was someone in Israel, there were people in London. And so, basically, we mailed this statuette, all over the world. And then, when each person was sort of done having their turn with it, then we gave it to Douglas's widow, and as I assume she still has it.
We might think of our heroes as being sort of cynical or inaccessible, but actually my experience with him was as somebody who was really human and interested in absolutely everything that went on around him in the world. And I think that type of holistic interest is something that game designers and game developers can really benefit from. We often tend to sort of get really up close with some of the very hard things about making games and maybe not take time to look to other fields and other disciplines for inspiration. One of the things Douglas stands for is this having this sort of like wider interest in the human condition and the world we live as a feed into the types of games and the types of experiences that we can create and share with our sort of future players. And that's probably the thing that really rests with me, nearly 20 years later.
I hope that was useful. I hope you've got a few minutes of something useful.
And that's it for this very special edition episode of the Game Informer Show. I want to thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode. If you just watched it, we encourage you to subscribe on iTunes or Google Play. We release new episodes every Thursday. Normally, it's a bunch of Game Informer editors sitting around talking about the biggest games that they've been playing, exciting stuff on the horizon, long-form interviews with game developers. So give it a chance and subscribe today if you haven't yet. But I also want to thank everyone that helped out with this episode. Obviously, Emma, Robbie, Steve, you're all a huge help. Tim Schafer, Gary Whitta. And a special thanks to the archival footage and interviews that we used throughout this podcast. So there was an Electric Playground clip in there, an old show called Computer Chronicles that we weaved in, an old audio interview with Aram Sinarek that was available on archive.org. So a bunch of classic resources. And again, thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode. It meant a lot to me, and I appreciate your support. And if you enjoyed it, please tell a friend and subscribe today, and we'll see you for the next episode. Thanks. Bye.